Everyday racism is a fact of life for people of color in this country, and while the social, economic, and political effects of racism have been studied broadly, the psychological impact of racism has received somewhat less attention. But now, planned changes to the diagnostic manual of mental disorders promises to shed more light on the effects of race-based trauma. So, what kind of a psychological impact does racism have on people of color? Joining me to discuss this are a team of my favorite Black people. We're joined by Camille Charles. She's a professor of sociology and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Chris Emdin is an associate professor of science education at Columbia University. Kimberly Williams is a freelance writer, and Dr. Monica Williams is a clinical psychologist. Dr. Williams, we'll start with you. I'm trying to make sense of this change in the diagnostic handbook, the DSM, I guess 5 now, is that what, DSM-4?
Right, yeah. DSM-5 is coming up.
Right, and what do these changes mean exactly?
Right. Well, first, let me just set the record straight in that the DSM is not yet ready to recognize race-based trauma as a form of PTSD. However, the new criteria do open the door to this by acknowledging that a series of minor slights or a series of maybe what might be seen as lesser types of trauma can accumulate and result in trauma. And that's often what we see with race-based trauma.
Okay, so I want you to help me translate that a little bit for those of us who aren't quite as smart. You're saying that there's a chance that ultimately race-based trauma, sort of events that are race-driven forms of trauma, for example, being racially discriminated against, or maybe the perception of being racially discriminated against, what some people call microaggressions, those kind of everyday acts.
Right.
Those things could be treated as a form of what you said, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Right. Having a culmination, having a lot of these happen to someone over a lifetime can result in becoming traumatized. Interesting. And what is the relationship between sort of PTSD and these experiences of racism? Because again, this idea of post-traumatic stress, people get it when it comes to a soldier coming home from war. People get it after forms of abuse, but people don't necessarily appreciate how everyday forms of racism could be part of a kind of project or an amalgam of trauma.
Right, you're absolutely right. And it's partially because I think we tend to downplay the effects of racism in our society. When I experience a racist event, I don't go and tell all my white friends about what happened because I'm sure that they won't understand. My experience often gets downplayed. And so when this happens enough of the time, we just don't talk about it, so people don't know how these things are affecting people of color.
Wow. And is that why this is such a big deal? If they were ready to turn that corner and make that change, would that be sort of a big deal because it would force a broader public, white people, to acknowledge the kind of legitimacy of this?
Absolutely. And we have lots and lots of research that links racism and discrimination to all sorts of terrible mental health outcomes. We see major depressive disorder among Hispanic Americans as a result of discrimination. And we see, again, these PTSD symptoms, particularly among African Americans.
I'm glad you said that because a national survey of American Life found that the African Americans show a prevalence rate of 9.1% of PTSD versus 6.8% for non-Hispanic whites. Is racism, you think, the cause of this gap between PTSD experiences?
Oh, absolutely. And in my opinion, again, we haven't done the research to get down to the bottom of this conclusively, but race-based trauma is a real problem. I do see it in my clinical practice, and people are suffering because of it.
Yeah, Mark, can I just jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Because I think it's not only are you not going to go and talk to your white friends about it, but it's because you now also have the anxiety over how they're going to react to it. Because it's not only the event itself, but it's that response where people say, well, maybe you just misunderstood, or maybe you're just oversensitive. So it's not even just the isolated event itself. It's actually what goes into the anticipation of people's response to your sharing that event with them. And I think the second thing I wanted to say was just to talk about the kind of everyday forms of racism. My daughter just turned 13, and we actually let her watch this is probably a bad parenting moment. We let her watch Django Unchained with us.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, no, but she, you know, she's real mature for her age, and she really gets the messages. But the interesting thing was that the next day we were walking through Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, and she says to me, "Mommy, I noticed that nobody moves out of the way for Black people when you're walking."
Interesting.
You know, yeah, and I said to her, this is something that actually I ended up talking to my therapist about in graduate school, because I noticed that when I walked on the sidewalk, it was always expected that I was the one to move out of the way, whether I was on the right or left side, whether they were men or women, old or young, that there was always this anticipation that I was supposed to be the one to move. And when I mentioned this to my therapist, I said, you know, am I out of my mind? Am I overreacting to this? And he said that no, actually, this was something that other students of color had been complaining about as one of many forms of microaggressions that they were experiencing on this predominantly white campus.
Now, I want to take that story back to the first point you made, Camille, because when you tell a story like that to a white person, I could hear them saying to you, you sure you ain't tripping? Like, maybe they just, you know, like, why do you think that this is particular to you? Maybe people don't move in anyway. Maybe people on the street are just rude and self-absorbed and don't even see you. How does this become an incidence of racism rather than just rude people?
Well, again, I imagine that part of it is going to be the way the individual perceives it. But as you know, Mark, I am a quantitative sociologist, and I collect data. So I started paying attention to who would move and who didn't.
Interesting.
And in fact, often with other people of color, and sometimes with women, whether they were of color or white, we would do this dance because we were both in these categories that were expected to move, and so we both move. But what I found was that if I chose not to move out of the way, I was consistently bumping into white males. And admittedly, that was my perception of it. But
so, sorry, I'll let you finish.
If you define that perception as real, it's real in its consequences. And so sometimes it is going to be overt expressions of discrimination and racism, but other times it is going to be these minor slights that may not be intentional, but the consequences of those experiences is negative.
So out of our conversation so far, there's two things I've just got to mention. Yeah. So the first thing is that so far the dialogue has revolved around the validation of the experiences of people of color by white people before we identify the experience as being one that is, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder. So in a sense, then we're saying, you know, if a white person doesn't understand the experience, then that devalues the fact that someone is going through this process. So the first thing is, man, beyond going to white people to ask whether or not they experience what we do, Black people don't have a tendency to talk to other Black people about the experience that they may have. So it's not an issue of validation from white folks. It's the issue of collectively our inability to be able to share what our experiences are, not because of validation, but because, you know, it's expected. So if you engage in a process where a white person treated you in a way where you felt slighted and it had an effect on you psychologically, you're not going to talk to white people about it, and you're not going to talk to Black people about it. And so the accumulation of those experiences leads to what Monica's describing, which is this sort of hypervigilance, which is sort of like an understated symptom of PTSD. So because you experience this for so long and it's become a part of your norms, you're walking through life thinking about experiencing life through this lens of what people are going to do or not do, how they're going to read me or receive me. And that is the outcome of PTSD. When it's this sort of understated, underlying, dormant, seemingly dormant reality that then sort of plays out when one scenario becomes the tipping point.
Chris,
that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Monica.
Oh, I was going to say, one of the things we do know about PTSD is that one of the things that maintains it is a sense of shame that keeps us from talking about it and processing our experience. So when we encounter these racist slights, be they large or small, they instill in us often a sense of shame. And we don't want to talk to white people. We don't want to talk to black people. We don't want to think about it. But it still germinates in the back of our head, causing these outcomes exactly as described, where we feel hypervigilant and jumpy and mistrustful. And that all contributes to the race-based trauma.
Yeah. To what extent, and Chris, I would be interested to know what you think about this as well as Camille, to what extent does the kind of narrative of post-racial society make it even more difficult to talk about this stuff?
I think that is it, you know, in my opinion. I mean, that's it. Because when you think about, I love the idea that, you know, there's this sort of identification of the fact that PTSD is outside of, you know, the generic traumatic situations. But when you're talking about a racial experience, a racial reality, like the notion of post-trauma in itself denotes that the trauma is over and you're learning to deal with it.
Right.
If you're living through it on a regular basis, there's no juncture, there's no fracture in the lived experience that allows you to be reflective or allows you to have an experience where you realize that this is going on. And like, you know, just a quick story, I'm just remembering I was 13 and there was a shootout on my block the night before. So I go to school the next day and somebody slams a door. So they slam the door and I immediately jump under the table.
Right.
So I jump under the table in the classroom and the teacher's like, why is this dude wilding out again? You know, why is Chris bugging out again? Why is he enacting these behaviors to distract the classroom? And I was sort of dealing with an event, but forced to deal with a reality that my reaction to my trauma is seen in a racialized way as me being distrustful or me being distracting to what's going on in the classroom. So the lived experience, you know, it causes us not to be able to detect post-trauma or lived trauma and the experiences that come out of that.
And it gets more complicated because you could probably go to a teacher and say, hey, look, I heard some gunshots last night, so when I hear loud noises, I hit the floor. I still do it, right? The difference is, if you were to appeal to someone and say, look, my response to these set of social circumstances are due to the fact that I experienced day-to-day racism, I'm not sure that the experience will be validated in the way that a gunshot would, because that's something tangible that they can say, all right, you know what, I could reasonably see that. But to try to explain to somebody, hey, look, I'm a little wary of this situation because when I walk down the street, white people don't move. You know, white people are like, well, that's your thing. That's your problem. You know, that's not legitimate.
Not only that, because we're supposed to judge each other as individuals, that's not me.
Right.
I'm not the one that doesn't move out of the way for you, and so you shouldn't judge me this way. Just as if a person of color expresses a sort of general suspicion of white people based on their lived experience, the individual white person that you're interacting with at that moment takes offense to that, and then we do get all into this whole notion of colorblindness and how we're post-racial because Barack Obama is both the best and worst thing that happened to Black America, right? Because on the one hand, we have a Black president. We can see something that as possible that was once impossible, but on the other hand, he is used as an end to any conversation about persisting racial prejudice, discrimination, conscious, unconscious, or whatever else it may be. We're not supposed to talk about it anymore because we have a Black president.
Yep.
I want to read a couple. Kim, I want to bring you in this conversation. I have some comments that are coming in response to this. I always, critical race theorists always talk about the value of counter narratives, and sometimes having a bunch of counter stories to the dominant story can help provide some support for these claims. Lena Bina writes in and says, oh my God, the sidewalk. I find this a time for me to be confrontational, and I do not move. I purposefully stay in my lane unless they acknowledge my presence, and I may move then. Elite 68 says, now I refuse to move. I will knock people down without hesitation unless it is a child, 19. Kimberly.
Yo, but she's joking, right? She's joking and saying that, listen, I'm going to knock people down. But that
maybe
in itself, but that in itself, though, it's an outcome of dealing with this with this traumatic situation where you're like, you're robbed of your humanity. So this young lady on a regular basis would probably be like, pardon me, you can rock, you can go. But because she's had a bevy of experiences that allows her to be so hyper conscious about her presence, about her body,
now
she's like, you know what? Now she's angry. Now she's gonna knock somebody over.
And when she knocks somebody over, all they hear is angry black woman, not
angry black woman, she assaulted me, there's something wrong with her, rather than looking at, hey, there's something wrong with our society that isn't acknowledging the fact that we have a different lived experience here.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, one second, Kimberly, you still there, Kimberly?
I'm still here.
Okay, good. I want to talk to you about some of this stuff too. There was a really interesting term called racial battle fatigue, where this is a quote: exposure to racial discrimination is analogous to the constant pressure soldiers face on the battlefield. We often think of soldiers as only being subjected to trauma when they're in the middle of a theater and there's a firefight, right? But the idea is that even when there's no gunfire, even when there's no active battle going on at that moment, there's still the tension and the trauma and the stress of being in that kind of situation. Similarly, people make the argument that racism and the experience of racial trauma is something that you don't just experience right in the moment of discrimination, right in the moment of racism, but also navigating life in a world where you're always having the threat of being assaulted by racism and these racist forces gives you a certain kind of trauma. In your experience, has that been the case? Have you experienced a sense of trauma and stress around race and these microaggressions that everybody's been talking about?
I mean, yes. And there is trauma that happens. It happens to various degrees, and you learn to deal and handle it in different ways, and that might include some form of actualized therapy, or it may include talking about it. I've been fortunate to have people I can discuss it with and discuss, the various racial events I've had occur to me. I've had people in the community where I can go back and have these discussions. One of the things with it, though, and I guess falling into that battle fatigue syndrome, is you don't always necessarily recognize in the moment that it is, or you don't necessarily perceive it in the moment as a racist act. So sometimes it's something that you have to kind of go back to, and you kind of go, wait, it was only me in the class that happened to, or I was the only person in the store that happened to. And it comes back to you, and then you realize, oh, I'm singled out, or this is something that I live with that a lot of peers who may not be of the same racial background aren't living with at the moment. There was a radio host, popular morning radio show on Friday, listening to the radio on my way to work, and he went on this whole long soliloquy about how he wears his black hoodie, and on days that he wears his black hoodie, everybody at the radio show thinks that he's some kind of scary monster, and he just kind of likes his black hoodie. And so on those mornings, though, people kind of start treating him differently. So now every time he puts on his black hoodie, he starts acting differently towards people because he knows that they're going to come at him with a certain mentality. And I tried so hard to call in and be like, this is what black people deal with on a day-to-day basis. We are in our quote-unquote cloaked black hoodies every single moment. And with that gives a certain perception from different people, and you deal with it, whether it be in a store. Saturday, I had a woman blatantly tell me in the middle of a department store, please do not touch my jewelry. That costs $500. And I'm looking at her like, chick, I got $500. You don't know me. I've had, people spoke about campus before. I feel like the school institution, especially non-majority black institutions, are a place where you see it play out very often, along with all the accusations of affirmative action and just the idea that you have to constantly prove yourself, or the idea that you don't necessarily belong here, allows people of all stripes to treat you in a certain manner. And it's something that you have to constantly fight against. And if you're not fighting against it, you may be forced to think about it. And sometimes it comes in the most unsuspecting moment. You might start tying your shoe, and then all of a sudden something triggers, and you remember a specific event when you stopped to tie a shoe and somebody thought that you were bending down to do something else, and have this certain reaction. So I do think it's something that definitely can cause trauma. I do also think that there is a fatigue that comes with it. And I feel that, mental health, just even within the black community, as you alluded to before, isn't necessarily always addressed as well as it could be. And it's not so much as always looking for it to be validated outside, but it's also just the fact that it's assumed, well, it's something we all live with, sugar. Like, we all been dealing with this for how long? Don't worry, you'll get through.
And getting through is the question that I have. Dr. Williams, help me understand how we can find outlets. Because the one thing that seems to cut across so many of the stories, from Camille to Chris to Kimberly to the people in the HuffPost community, is that we all have these stories, we all have these experiences, and I haven't heard anybody talk about their outlets for these experiences. Where do you dump this stuff? What is an adaptive, healthy way to do it? Because as cathartic as it feels to knock over somebody on the street, and trust me, I get it. You know what I mean? I suspect that DSM-4 wouldn't call that adaptive coping, right? So how do we find healthy ways to deal with these issues, to tell our stories, to be heard, to find common ground and common community where people don't think I'm crazy because I get followed around in the store and they're not really trying to help me?
Right.
What do I do, Dr. Williams?
Right. And this.
Oh, I thought I really stumped her for a minute. We're having a technical issue. I was like, damn, that was a good question. Yeah, no, so but let me ask you while we're working out Monica's stuff, Camille, what do you do like after a day of stress?
This is a really good question.
Oh, wait.
Hold on.
Yes.
I think we got her. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you. Yes, so the problem is these things affect our sense of self-esteem, because when we meet a microaggression or some sort of a slight or assault, we don't know if it's because of our color, because the attacks are not blatant anymore, or if it's because of something about us. And so then we question, well, did I do something wrong? Is there something wrong with me? Am I defective in some way? And this is why it's so important to talk with other people who understand, other people who've been through it, therapists who get it, friends who understand and who've been there, because that's how we start to process and make sense out of it. And we can come to a place where we understand it and we're okay. We're not okay with racism in society, but we're okay with who we are, because we understand that it's not about us. It's about someone else's attitudes that we have taken onto ourselves and don't need to.
We have a comment coming in from Al B. Dam. He says, that concept is why, having gone to a mostly white high school, I made sure I went to Hampton University, in HBCU, historically black college or university. I was tired of correcting racism, justifying my presence. I just wanted to enjoy going to school. That's what the HBCU experience did for me. Camille, in addition to studying race, you also study higher education.
Right.
Is this an interesting and helpful way to deal with this, finding communities like it? Because school is certainly a place where you experience everyday racism. So if I make a decision to go to an HBCU, is that a good, healthy way for a student to kind of move outside of that conversation, to kind of move outside of the daily assault of racial microaggression?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly one way to handle it. I think there are many ways to handle it, and I think that the appropriate way is going to vary by the individual. So, you know, I think that that's one way to deal with it. If you opt to go to a predominantly white institution and you're sort of getting your dose of the real world sooner and more often at a time when maybe it would be better if you could focus on something else, I think you have to look for ways to actually focus on the things that you need to, while dealing healthily with these other aspects of life that do throw curveballs at you on a regular basis. And so, you know, I am constantly suggesting to my students that they go to CAPS, which is our psychological services office, to talk to people, because you don't have to be quote unquote crazy. You just need help finding the appropriate strategy for you, whether it's meditation or exercise, or again, finding the moments where you actually do stand up for yourself. So going back to my daughter, I explained to my daughter, you have to pick your battles. I don't want you running into everybody. I want you being respectful of people, but I also want you to respect yourself and to be aware of what's going on around you, and make note of those things and understand that there's nothing wrong with you. You know, the problem isn't with you. It's, you know, it is with society. It's with this particular individual who feels so entitled as to think that you, and maybe they think everyone should get out of the way. We don't know for sure, but, you know, I think you have to have the conversations and make it okay to have those conversations, again, in a safe space with people who aren't going to challenge your sanity.
So just two things really quickly. One, related to how do you deal with these, whether you call them microaggressions, traumatic situations, or oppressive realities, is that historically, people of color, African Americans in the United States, have found an avenue for dealing with these aggressions through our cultural expressions, and through religion and church, through music, through dance, and the more contemporary ways through hip hop and hip hop culture. And so I know Mark knew I was going to get to hip hop at one point. But
all you black people get to hip hop eventually if I keep you on long enough.
Listen, but what I'm saying is there are a lot. If you listen to hip hop lyrics, if you go look at folks who are doing hip hop education with youth of color who are experiencing oppressive realities, that is a cultural artifact that becomes a mechanism for being able to deal with these sort of oppressive realities that you have no other outlets from.
Is there a danger though in that, right? Because, you know, when we go to our churches or we go to our mosques or we go to our cultural traditions of music or art, is there a way in which we place more stress or burden? The reason I ask that question is because we have a comment coming in from 113 who says, I had an African-American professor have a sit down with me saying that I need to work twice as hard as the white students around me because the perception in the department was that I was not as good a student. After that, I was even more stressed by school on top of the work. So if we listen to music or go to cultural traditions or spaces that tell us about the struggle, does that ever create more of a burden, more of a stress than not knowing it or not engaging it?
Well, the thing is, the invalidation of our cultural artifacts as non-academic or non-appropriate forms of cultural expression is a larger issue that's part of what causes PTSD. The fact that I have a built-in tradition within my culture to help me to build resilience from the nonsense you put me through, and then in academic spaces, I am told that that's not an appropriate measure of getting out my frustrations is problematic. And so, you know, part of our work, or part of my work in particular, is the reclaiming of these cultural artifacts and tools as appropriate mechanisms for dealing with stress, but also for gaining academic knowledge. You know what I mean? So,
right. You know, Mark, one thing, I think I'm older than all of you by quite a bit, because I'm thinking about that comment, and when I was a kid, my parents told me that every day.
Mine too.
It was not something that they didn't tell me in a way to make me stress out about it. They told me as just kind of a rule to live by in terms of the world that we lived in. And in fact, I think in the long run, it was helpful in the sense that I knew what to expect.
But does it create, some might argue it creates a kind of problem because you spend your whole life thinking that the world isn't fair. And it might not be.
Maybe it's the fact that it was put to me not in a way that suggested that I wasn't good enough, but rather in a way that explained to me that people didn't always see me for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Gotcha.
And so they weren't necessarily looking at me as an individual, and that they might have been bringing their own preconceived misconceptions to the table, and that, you know, basically this was just my doubling down to ensure that even when they did that, they couldn't take away what I knew myself to be, and that in fact it sort of protected against my giving up.
Yeah.
And thinking, you know, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, because actually it matters a lot what I do. And in some ways, and getting back to the idea of an HBCU, I thought about Claude Steele's stereotype threat. And I asked him once, you know, so what are you supposed to do to help your kid not be susceptible to stereotype threat? And his response was desensitization. That basically, if they perform poorly on standardized tests, you want them in prep classes and you want them taking practice tests, because eventually they'll become desensitized to it.
Interesting.
One could argue that, you know, that staying in the mainstream environment, if that's what you want to call it, offers that opportunity for desensitization. Now, again, I'm one who believes firmly that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this, and that you have to figure out what works for you.
And I think that's the challenge. But certainly, Monica, and I'll give you the last word on this, having a medical tradition, particularly a psychological tradition that has historically been at the other side of the equation, not only ignoring sort of racial truths about black people, but sort of creating narratives about black mental disorder, normalizing a culture that says that any kind of resistance to racism is itself an act of being of mental disorder. I mean, we're talking about a medical tradition that created terms like drapetomania, right? The idea that running from a plantation made you crazy. You know,
right.
I mean, when you have a medical tradition like that, maybe turning the corner and saying, you know, not only is that stuff bad, but there might be some legitimacy to the types of claims Black folk have been making for centuries about the everyday forms of stress and trauma that are accumulated through racial wounds. We might actually have a space and an opportunity as a culture to take this stuff seriously and heal.
Absolutely. And you know, it has been a long, slow road. The entire discipline of psychology, it's really still in its infancy. We are really just sort of getting to the point now where researchers are saying, hey, we need to actually look at the experience of people of color. And for a lot of people, this is an epiphany. I mean, I've been saying this all along, and so have many of my colleagues, like, hey, we need to really start studying people of color to understand their experience. But this is an idea that's really taking hold. And I think that soon, maybe not this year or next year, but I do think in the next 10 years, we'll have a very clear understanding of how all these things work together and what we can do to help improve mental health among those of us who do experience these issues daily.
Absolutely. I'm going to end with a comment from our community. A Leach 68, she's the one who talked about wanting to knock people over before. She said, I wasn't joking. I bumped with the intention of knocking them off balance. Never thought of it as me being looked at as an angry Black female, though. I find that revelation a bit disturbing, very eye-opening, however. Might have to reconsider my actions moving forward. See what you all have done? We change the world one person at a time.
That's right. One less angry Black woman.
That's right. All right, y'all. Camille, Chris, Kimberly, thank you for joining us via phone. And of course, Dr. Williams, thank you. In fact, all of these people are fine, brilliant doctors. And they are great guests, and they are great people to contribute to a conversation. But I want you to be in this conversation as well. Click a text button, click a video button, leave a comment, hit the red on air button, be a guest here at HuffPost Live. The conversation always continues.